Sarah Miller's car keys still dangled from the ignition when her abandoned vehicle was discovered near Penn's. Landing in Philadelphia on a crisp November morning in 1987, the 29-year-old elementary school teacher had vanished without warning, leaving behind a half-graded stack of student papers on the passenger seat and a cooling cup of coffee in the center console. At 7:18 p.m. the previous evening, a security camera outside Geno's Steaks captured her walking to her parked blue Chevrolet, chatting cheerfully on her bulky mobile phone with her sister, promising to help plan her nephew's birthday party that weekend. Sarah wore a burgundy turtleneck sweater, dark wool coat, and moved with the confident stride that her students at Franklin Elementary admired. A witness briefly observed her unlock her car door, a content expression visible as she settled into the driver's seat. The events that followed would plunge Philadelphia into a haunting mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Philadelphia, 1987, stood as a city of contrasts. Historic cobblestone streets and colonial architecture mingled with modern skyscrapers and bustling commerce. Known as the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia prided itself on tight-knit neighborhoods where Italian bakeries, Irish pubs, and Polish delis fostered a sense of community across generations. Residents gathered for block parties, church socials, and passionate debates about the Phillies and Eagles, creating a web of connection that seemed to keep everyone safe. In a charming row house on Spruce Street in Society Hill, Sarah Miller lived alone, but was never truly isolated. Her life intertwined with her neighbors, her classroom of third graders, and her large extended family scattered throughout the city's diverse neighborhoods. At 29, Sarah had established herself as a dedicated educator, known for staying late to help struggling students and organizing creative classroom projects that transformed learning into adventure. Friends described her as the person everyone called when they needed a shoulder to cry on or help moving apartments. She kept a meticulous planner, color-coding her commitments and arriving early to every appointment. Her row house reflected this organized nature, bookshelves arranged by subject, kitchen spices in alphabetical order, and lesson plans drafted weeks in advance. On the evening of November 12, 1987, no one could have imagined the careful rhythm of her life was about to be shattered. Sarah had left Franklin Elementary around 4:30 p.m. after staying late to prepare materials for the next day's science experiment. Colleagues remembered her waving goodbye, mentioning she planned to stop for a quick dinner before heading home to finish grading papers. Security footage later revealed she had visited Geno's Steaks, ordering her usual cheesesteak with onions and chatting briefly with the cashier about the unseasonably cold weather. At 7:18 p.m., Sarah was captured by the security camera outside Geno's, walking toward her car while speaking on her mobile phone, a bulky, expensive device that few owned in 1987, gifted by her brother, who worked for a telecommunications company. The call connected her to her sister, Elizabeth. Their conversation was ordinary, yet would become painfully significant. Sarah talked about buying supplies for her nephew's birthday, mentioned grading papers that evening, and promised to call back with party ideas. Her voice sounded relaxed and forward-looking. It would be the last time anyone heard Sarah speak. What happened after she drove away from Geno's remains a void in time that haunted Philadelphia for decades. When Sarah didn't arrive at school the next morning, the first absence in her teaching career, the principal called her home. No answer. By afternoon, when Sarah missed a scheduled doctor's appointment and hadn't responded to mounting messages on her answering machine, Elizabeth grew concerned enough to drive to her sister's row house. The front door was locked, newspapers untouched on the porch. Inside, the house stood in perfect order, but with the eerie emptiness of a life interrupted. Sarah's bed remained made, her coffee mug washed and dried on the rack. Her lesson plans for the day lay neatly on her desk, alongside a half-written letter to her parents. Elizabeth stood in the silent living room, a growing dread tightening her chest. This wasn't like Sarah, meticulous, reliable Sarah, who called when she'd be even 5 minutes late. As evening approached, Elizabeth contacted the Philadelphia Police Department. 2 officers arrived within the hour, notepads in hand, as they recorded details with professional detachment. They asked methodical questions. When was Sarah last seen? Did she have a boyfriend? Any financial troubles? Any reason she might want to disappear? Elizabeth answered firmly, growing increasingly frustrated with what seemed like implications that her sister had simply walked away from her life. Sarah would never abandon her students midweek, Elizabeth insisted, her voice catching. She has 28 third graders expecting her to explain photosynthesis tomorrow. She spent hours cutting out paper leaves for them. The officers exchanged glances, making notes without comment. They asked for a photo of Sarah, which Elizabeth provided. A recent snapshot from a family picnic, Sarah laughing beneath a maple tree, her dark hair catching sunlight. With professional neutrality, they promised to file a missing persons report and check hospitals. As the officers left, neighbors began to gather on the street. Mrs. Donovan from next door brought over a pot of tea, while Mr. Kapinski from across the street offered to drive around nearby parking lots. By nightfall, a small crowd had assembled outside Sarah's home, concern visible in their furrowed brows. This neighborhood, where doors were often left unlocked and children played freely on sidewalks, suddenly felt exposed and uncertain. The community mobilized with remarkable speed. By morning, handmade flyers bearing Sarah's photo and the word "missing" appeared on telephone poles and store windows throughout Society Hill, spreading outward to neighboring districts. Parents from Franklin Elementary established a phone tree, calling through Sarah's contacts. Local businesses donated coffee and sandwiches to search volunteers who gathered in Washington Square Park, ready to comb the city. The uncertainty grew heavier with each passing hour. Elizabeth's husband, Michael, established a temporary command center in Sarah's living room, answering constant calls from concerned friends. While their parents drove in from Pittsburgh, their faces ashen with worry. The family dog, a retriever named Cooper that Sarah often watched on weekends, lay whimpering by the door, as if sensing the wrongness permeating the house. At 10:17 a.m. on November 14th, nearly 40 hours after Sarah was last seen, a dock worker spotted a blue Chevrolet parked near Penn's Landing, its driver's door slightly ajar despite the morning drizzle. Looking closer, he noticed the keys still in the ignition and papers scattered across the passenger seat. Something about the abandoned vehicle prompted him to call the police before continuing his rounds. Officers arrived within minutes, immediately recognizing the license plate number from the missing persons report filed the previous day. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape, their movements deliberate as they photographed the vehicle from multiple angles. Inside, they found Sarah's purse on the floor, containing her wallet with credit cards and cash untouched. Her gradebook lay open on the passenger seat beside stacks of children's essays, a red pen still uncapped. A half-empty coffee cup sat in the center console, lipstick marks visible on its rim. What they didn't find was any sign of Sarah herself. When Elizabeth received the call about the discovered car, she and Michael rushed to Penn's Landing, only to be stopped at the police line. From a distance, Elizabeth could see officers in latex gloves carefully removing items from the vehicle, placing them in evidence bags. The sight of her sister's familiar blue Chevrolet, now transformed into a crime scene, made the situation suddenly, horrifyingly real. Elizabeth collapsed against Michael, her legs buckling as the terrible possibility crashed over her. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. Someone had taken her. The discovery of the vehicle transformed the nature of the investigation. What had been treated as a routine missing persons case now shifted to a potential abduction. Detective James Reeves, a veteran of Philadelphia's Major Crimes Unit, arrived at the scene as forensic technicians were processing the car interior. Known for his methodical approach and unflappable demeanor, Reeves had investigated some of the city's most challenging cases over his 20-year career. "Anything stand out?" Reeves asked the lead technician, squinting against the strengthening rain. "No obvious signs of struggle in the vehicle," the technician replied, closing an evidence bag. "But we found something interesting on the driver's seat." He pointed to a small reddish-brown stain, barely visible against the dark upholstery. "Could be blood. We're testing it now." Reeves nodded grimly, his experienced eyes scanning the waterfront. Penn's Landing in 1987 was undergoing redevelopment, with construction sites alongside abandoned warehouses, places where someone could disappear without witnesses. He turned his attention to nearby security cameras, but in 1987, surveillance technology was limited and sporadic. The closest camera belonged to a shipping company half a block away. Whether it had captured anything relevant remained to be seen. News of Sarah's abandoned car spread rapidly through Philadelphia's neighborhoods. The afternoon edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer ran the headline, "Local teacher's empty car, found at Penn's Landing. Foul play suspected." A grainy photo of Sarah's Chevrolet behind police tape accompanied the article, along with a school portrait of Sarah smiling warmly at the camera. The media coverage intensified as local TV stations sent reporters to broadcast live from Penn's Landing. "We're standing where 29-year-old Sarah Miller's car was discovered this morning," one reporter narrated, the Delaware River visible behind her. "Police are asking anyone who may have seen anything unusual in this area Wednesday night to come forward immediately." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For Sarah's family, watching these broadcasts felt surreal. The sister, daughter, and teacher they loved had been transformed into a news headline, her disappearance now public property. Elizabeth found herself simultaneously grateful for the attention that might help find Sarah and horrified by the speculation already beginning to swirl. Some reports emphasized Sarah's status as a single woman living alone, while others questioned why she would be at Penn's Landing after dark. By evening, Detective Reeves had assembled a task force dedicated to Sarah's case. They gathered in a conference room at police headquarters, walls quickly covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. Reeves stood before his team, tapping a marker against his palm. "What we know for certain," he began, "is that Sarah Miller was last seen at 7:18 p.m. on November 12th, leaving Geno's Steaks. Her car was found approximately 39 hours later at Penn's Landing. In between those points," he drew a long line on the whiteboard, "is where we need answers." The investigation spread in multiple directions. One team focused on reviewing security footage from businesses along possible routes between Geno's and Penn's Landing. Another interviewed Sarah's colleagues, friends, and the parents of her students. A third group canvassed the waterfront area, questioning dock workers, security guards, and homeless individuals who might have witnessed something. By the third day, the investigation had yielded troubling clues. The substance on the driver's seat was confirmed to be blood, though the amount was small. More concerning was what forensic specialists found in the trunk. Several long, dark hairs that didn't match Sarah's shoulder-length brown hair, and fibers from an unknown fabric that didn't correspond to anything in Sarah's wardrobe or car interior. Meanwhile, interviews painted a picture of Sarah's life that offered no obvious motives for her disappearance. She had no known enemies, no significant debt, and her recent phone records showed no unusual patterns. Her last boyfriend had moved to Chicago nearly a year earlier, and they had parted on good terms. The principal at Franklin Elementary emphasized Sarah's dedication to her students and stellar performance reviews. One potential lead emerged when a night security guard at a construction site near Penn's Landing reported seeing a dark van parked in an unusual spot around 9:30 p.m. on the night Sarah vanished. He hadn't thought much of it until hearing about the missing teacher. The guard couldn't recall specific details about the van, but remembered thinking it was out of place in an area usually empty after working hours. At a press conference on November 17th, Detective Reeves faced a barrage of questions from increasingly anxious reporters. Philadelphia, a city still healing from the fractures of the 1970s economic decline and struggling with rising crime rates, felt particularly vulnerable to the idea that a beloved teacher could vanish without explanation. "We're pursuing multiple leads," Reeves stated carefully, "but we need the public's help. Anyone who was in the area of Penn's Landing on the evening of November 12th, or who might have seen Ms. Miller or her blue Chevrolet between 7:18 p.m. and midnight, please contact our dedicated hotline." Behind the podium, Elizabeth stood with her parents, their faces drawn with exhaustion. When offered the chance to speak, Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Sarah is more than a headline," she said, looking directly into the cameras. "She's a daughter who calls our parents every Sunday without fail. She's a teacher who stays up late making personalized feedback for each student. She's my sister, who remembers everyone's birthday and makes homemade cards. Someone knows what happened to her. Please, if you know anything at all, help us bring her home." The press conference aired across Pennsylvania, generating hundreds of calls to the police hotline. Most were dead ends, supposed sightings that couldn't be verified, psychics offering visions, conspiracy theories linking Sarah's disappearance to other crimes. But among the noise, potentially valuable information emerged. 3 separate callers reported seeing a dark van driving erratically near Society Hill around 8:30 p.m. on the night Sarah disappeared. Another witness claimed to have seen a woman resembling Sarah arguing with a man in a parked car near South Street, though the details were frustratingly vague. As Thanksgiving approached without resolution, Sarah's case began to strain the resources of the Philadelphia Police Department. Other crimes demanded attention, and despite Detective Reeves' passionate advocacy, the number of officers assigned to the task force gradually diminished. The media coverage, once constant, became sporadic as newer stories captured public interest. For Sarah's family, this felt like a second betrayal. First, Sarah had been taken, and now it seemed the urgency to find her was fading. Elizabeth and her husband converted their dining room into a makeshift investigation center, pinning maps to walls and organizing volunteers to distribute flyers and search areas the police had designated lower priority. Franklin Elementary held a candlelight vigil where students, parents, and teachers gathered in the school gymnasium. Sarah's third graders wrote messages on colorful paper leaves, creating a hoping tree that stood in the school entrance. "We miss your science experiments," one child wrote. "Please come back and teach us about butterflies," pleaded another. As November turned to December, the initial shock of Sarah's disappearance evolved into a persistent ache for those who loved her. Elizabeth quit her job at an accounting firm to dedicate herself full-time to finding her sister. She appeared on local talk shows, coordinated volunteer searches, and met weekly with Detective Reeves to review any developments, no matter how minor. But as winter deepened, even the most dedicated supporters began to acknowledge an uncomfortable reality. With each passing day, the likelihood of finding Sarah alive diminished. The investigation, once bustling with activity, settled into a rhythm of checking and rechecking the same leads, interviewing the same witnesses, and reviewing the same evidence without breakthrough. By the 1-year anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, her case had joined the growing files of Philadelphia's unsolved mysteries. Detective Reeves, though officially assigned to new cases, kept Sarah's file on his desk, reviewing it during quiet moments and following up on occasional new leads. But the trail had gone cold, leaving behind a family consumed by questions without answers, and a community forever changed by the knowledge that one of their own had vanished without a trace. In Society Hill, residents who once left doors unlocked now installed security systems. Parents who previously allowed children to play unsupervised began walking them to school. The carefree spirit that had defined Philadelphia's historic neighborhoods gave way to a cautious vigilance, a silent acknowledgement that the city of brotherly love had betrayed one of its daughters, and no one knew who might be next. By the 5th anniversary of Sarah Miller's disappearance, her case had fallen into a painful rhythm familiar to families of the missing. Each November, Philadelphia newspapers would run a small update, usually buried deep in the metro section. Teacher's 1987 disappearance still unsolved. Local TV stations occasionally mentioned the case during their cold case segments, showing the same school photo of Sarah alongside brief interview clips with Detective Reeves, now graying and increasingly frustrated. For Elizabeth Brennan, née Miller, these annual reminders were both heartbreaking and necessary. She had married Michael in 1989, a subdued ceremony with an empty chair for her sister, but never stopped searching. The dining room in their Queen Village home remained dedicated to Sarah's case, walls lined with maps, timelines, and photos that Elizabeth updated meticulously as new forensic techniques developed throughout the 1990s. Some people think it's unhealthy. Elizabeth confided to a support group for families of missing persons. They say I should move on or find closure. But how do you close a book when you don't know the ending? The group members nodded in understanding, many carrying similar burdens of uncertainty. Detective James Reeves faced his own struggles with the case. Though officially transferred to homicide in 1990, he kept a copy of Sarah's file in his desk drawer, reviewing it during quiet moments and lunch breaks. His colleagues grew accustomed to finding him hunched over the yellowing pages, muttering about the dark van or the unidentified hair fibers found in Sarah's trunk. "You can't save them all, Jim," his captain advised during a performance review. "The Miller case isn't active. You've got 16 current homicides on your desk." Reeves nodded, but later that evening returned to the evidence locker where Sarah's belongings remained sealed in plastic bags. Her purse, the red grading pen, the coffee cup preserved with her lipstick mark. Something about this case refused to release its grip on him, a persistent feeling that the answer existed just beyond his grasp. Philadelphia itself underwent significant changes through the early 1990s. Society Hill, where Sarah had lived, became increasingly gentrified. The row house she once occupied changed hands multiple times, its connection to the famous cold case becoming a macabre selling point whispered by realtors. Penn's Landing transformed with new development, erasing the landscape where her car had been found, and with it, potentially valuable crime scene context. Sarah's third-grade students, 8 and 9 years old when she disappeared, were now attending college. Occasionally, one would contact Elizabeth after seeing a memorial article, sharing memories of how Ms. Miller had encouraged their interest in science or helped them overcome reading difficulties. These stories both comforted and devastated Elizabeth, glimpses of the life and impact her sister should have continued to have. The technological limitations of 1987 had hampered the original investigation. Security cameras were sparse and low quality. DNA testing was primitive by modern standards. Cell phone tracking didn't exist for Sarah's early model mobile. By 1992, advances in forensic science prompted a review of physical evidence, but yielded limited new information. The blood on the driver's seat was confirmed as Sarah's, but the quantity suggested a minor injury rather than a fatal wound. The hairs found in the trunk could only be identified as belonging to a Caucasian male, a frustratingly broad characteristic. In 1994, Philadelphia police implemented a new computer system for cross-referencing unsolved cases. Detective Reeves spent weeks entering details from Sarah's file, hoping patterns might emerge when compared with other disappearances. The system flagged 3 cases with potentially significant similarities: women in their 20s and 30s who vanished after being seen in their vehicles, all within a 50-mile radius of Philadelphia between 1985 and 1991. None had been resolved. This could be the work of a serial offender. Reeves proposed in a department meeting, pointing to the geographic and methodological similarities. His theory gained limited traction. Budget constraints and the passage of time pushed cold cases further down the priority list. The potential connections remained unexplored beyond a cursory review that revealed no obvious shared suspects. Reeves continued investigating on his own time, contacting detectives in neighboring counties who had worked the similar cases, but collaborative efforts stalled without institutional support. For the Miller family, 1997 marked a painful decision point. After 10 years without answers, they faced the legal option of having Sarah declared dead in absentia. The proceeding would allow for life insurance claims, the settlement of her modest estate, and what some called practical closure. The family gathered at their parents' home in Pittsburgh to discuss the unbearable choice. "It feels like giving up," Elizabeth whispered, clutching a photo album open to images of her and Sarah as children. "Like we're saying she's gone forever." Their father, his health failing from a decade of stress and grief, spoke softly. "Sarah will never be gone while we remember her. But we need to acknowledge what seems most likely for our own survival." The legal declaration was filed that summer, a procedural formality that carried crushing emotional weight. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a feature titled "A Decade of Mystery, the Sarah Miller Case," recounting the investigation's many dead ends and featuring interviews with former students, now high schoolers, who still remembered their third-grade teacher's kind smile and creative lessons. Following the declaration, the Millers held a memorial service at Franklin Elementary. The school dedicated its library to Sarah's memory, unveiling a bronze plaque bearing her image and the words, "A teacher opens doors." Elizabeth stood at the podium, facing hundreds of attendees, including many of Sarah's former colleagues and students. "Today isn't about saying goodbye," she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It's about honoring Sarah's impact on this community and recommitting ourselves to finding answers. Someone knows what happened on November 12, 1987. Someone has carried that secret for a decade. We haven't forgotten and we never will." Detective Reeves attended the service in plain clothes, standing at the back of the auditorium. Approaching retirement age, his hair now more salt than pepper, he felt the weight of his greatest professional failure. As people filed out, Elizabeth spotted him and crossed the room. "You're still looking, aren't you?" she asked. Reeves nodded. "Every day in some way. I promised you I wouldn't stop." "Neither will I," she replied, squeezing his arm. Their shared determination, though unable to bring Sarah home, formed a bond that sustained them both through the increasingly faint hope of resolution. As the millennium approached, advances in forensic technology offered new possibilities for cold cases. DNA testing became more sophisticated, allowing for analysis of smaller samples and mitochondrial DNA that could identify familial connections even when direct matches weren't possible. In 1998, the Philadelphia Police Department established a dedicated cold case unit, digitizing old files and re-evaluating evidence with modern techniques. Sarah's case was among the first reviewed. The hairs found in her trunk, preserved in evidence for 11 years, underwent advanced DNA testing. Though degraded by time, scientists extracted a partial profile, not enough for a conclusive identification, but sufficient to eliminate suspects if comparisons became possible. The fabric fibers found with the hair were also reanalyzed, identified as a specific type of work glove, manufactured primarily for construction and dock work, potentially significant given the waterfront location where Sarah's car was found. These developments rekindled media interest temporarily. A national true crime television program featured Sarah's case in early 1999, broadcasting reenactments of her last known movements and interviews with Elizabeth and Detective Reeves. The show generated hundreds of tips, most speculative or demonstrably false, but a few merited further investigation. One caller, a former security guard at Penn's Landing, claimed to remember a dock worker who drove a dark van and frequently worked late shifts in November 1987. The man had abruptly quit his job shortly after Sarah's disappearance. Though intriguing, the lead proved difficult to pursue. Employment records from the era were incomplete, and the company that had operated that section of the waterfront had long since gone bankrupt, its personnel files lost or destroyed. Another viewer reported seeing a woman matching Sarah's description at a gas station in western Pennsylvania the day after she disappeared. The witness claimed the woman appeared distressed and was accompanied by a tall man who didn't allow her to speak to the attendant. While potentially significant, the 12-year delay in reporting this sighting and the witness's inability to provide specific details beyond this general impression limited its investigative value. By 2000, Detective Reeves had reached mandatory retirement age. His departure from the force felt like another door closing on Sarah's case. At his retirement party, surrounded by colleagues celebrating his distinguished career, Reeves found himself drawn to a quiet corner, thinking about the one case he couldn't solve. Elizabeth attended the gathering, presenting him with a framed photo of Sarah. "She would have wanted you to know how much your dedication meant," Elizabeth said. "And this isn't goodbye. I expect regular updates on any ideas that come to you at 3 in the morning." Reeves laughed softly, but the agreement was sincere. Though no longer carrying a badge, he continued reviewing the case files he'd legally obtained copies of, consulting informally with former colleagues, and meeting with Elizabeth monthly to discuss theories both old and new. The early 2000s brought both setbacks and glimmers of hope. In 2002, Sarah's parents passed away within months of each other, never having learned their daughter's fate. The painful loss further narrowed the circle of those who carried Sarah's memory as a lived experience rather than a famous case study. However, the same period saw the creation of national databases for DNA profiles and unidentified remains, increasing the possibility that evidence from Sarah's case might eventually find a match. The cold case unit periodically ran the partial DNA profile from the hairs against these expanding databases, but found no matches. They also cross-referenced Sarah's dental records and physical description with unidentified remains discovered throughout the region, a grim but necessary process that yielded no connections. Elizabeth channeled her grief into advocacy, becoming a prominent voice for families of missing persons. She founded a non-profit organization that provided resources to help families navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of long-term missing person cases. The group's annual vigil in Washington Square Park grew from a small gathering to an event attended by hundreds, honoring not just Sarah, but all those who had vanished without resolution. By 2007, 20 years after Sarah's disappearance, her case had acquired almost mythic status in Philadelphia. Local crime writers published speculative books proposing various theories, ranging from methodical analysis of available evidence to sensationalist claims connecting Sarah's case to notorious serial killers active in the 1980s. Documentary filmmakers contacted Elizabeth regularly, most seeking dramatic content rather than meaningful investigation. James Reeves, now in his 70s but still sharp-minded, viewed most of these projects with skepticism. "They're making entertainment," he told Elizabeth over coffee at their regular diner meeting. "We're still looking for truth." The truth remained elusive, but neither had abandoned hope entirely. Technological advances continued to create new investigative avenues. In 2009, improved image enhancement techniques allowed for clearer analysis of the grainy security footage from Geno's stakes and nearby businesses. While no breakthrough emerged, analysts identified a dark figure briefly visible in the background of one frame, potentially watching Sarah from across the street, a detail missed in the original review. That same year, the Cold Case Unit initiated a project to create Geographic Information System, GIS, mapping of crimes from the 1980s and 90s, plotting unsolved murders, disappearances, and assaults to identify potential patterns. Sarah's case appeared as one data point among hundreds, but the visualization revealed clusters of similar crimes along the Delaware River waterfront during that era, suggesting possible connections previously unrecognized. In 2011, Elizabeth received an unexpected call from Detective Lena Ortiz, a young officer recently assigned to the cold case unit. "We're implementing a new approach to selected cases," Ortiz explained. "Comprehensive file reviews conducted by fresh eyes, combined with advanced forensic technology. Sarah's case has been chosen as one of our priorities." The news sparked conflicting emotions for Elizabeth. Hope mingled with the fear of another disappointment. 24 years had passed. What could possibly emerge now that hadn't been discovered before? Nevertheless, she agreed to meet with Detective Ortiz, bringing the extensive research she'd compiled over decades. Ortiz, barely born when Sarah disappeared, brought a different perspective unencumbered by the investigative assumptions of the 1980s. She questioned elements of the case that had been accepted as fact, particularly the timeline between Sarah leaving Geno's and her car being found at Penn's Landing. The original investigation assumed Sarah drove directly toward Penn's Landing and was intercepted en route, Ortiz noted, spreading maps across the table in the cold case unit's office. But what if she went somewhere else first? What if the Penn's Landing location was chosen specifically because it was away from where the actual abduction occurred? This fresh approach coincided with Philadelphia's digitization of historical records, including building permits, construction projects, and employment records from city-contracted work in the 1980s. These databases, though incomplete, offered new context about activities near both Geno's and Penn's Landing during that period. One significant discovery emerged. A major sewer repair project had been underway 3 blocks from Geno's in November 1987. The construction required night work to minimize traffic disruption, with crews active until 10 p.m., creating unusual activity in an otherwise quiet area around the time Sarah disappeared. The company contracted for this work, Eastern Municipal Services, had employed dozens of temporary workers, their records now fragmented across various city archives. "This could be nothing," Ortiz cautioned during a briefing with Elizabeth and the retired Reeves, whom she'd invited as a courtesy. "But it provides context we didn't have before, a reason for vehicles and workers to be in that area after dark, potential witnesses who were never interviewed, or suspects who had a reason to be there without arousing suspicion," Reeves finished, leaning forward with renewed energy. Elizabeth listened intently, cautious about embracing yet another theory that might lead nowhere. After decades of false starts, she had developed a protective emotional distance from new developments. Yet she couldn't deny the small flame of hope that flickered as Ortiz outlined plans to track down former Eastern municipal workers still living in the region. The investigation gained unexpected momentum in early 2012. When the Philadelphia Police Department received a substantial federal grant to process DNA evidence from cold cases using advanced techniques not available in previous decades. Sarah's case, with its preserved hair samples and blood evidence, qualified for priority testing. Scientists now had access to technology that could extract usable DNA profiles from samples previously considered too degraded or contaminated for reliable analysis. The partial profile derived from the hairs in 1998 could potentially be enhanced, providing more genetic markers for comparison. Additionally, the blood sample from the driver's seat, though confirmed as Sarah's, might contain mingled DNA from whoever had contact with her, touch DNA transferred through skin cells that previous testing methods couldn't detect. As the 25th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached, these parallel investigative tracks, the construction worker angle and the advanced DNA testing, proceeded with methodical care. Elizabeth found herself once again checking her phone frequently, both dreading and hoping for news from Detective Ortiz. November 12, 2012 marked a quarter century since Sarah vanished. Franklin Elementary, where many staff had never known Sarah personally, still held an annual remembrance. The library bearing her name hosted a reading event where current third graders shared stories about courage and persistence. Elizabeth attended, now approaching the age her parents had been when Sarah disappeared, the weight of being her sister's only remaining voice increasingly heavy on her shoulders. That evening, media outlets ran anniversary pieces about the case. The Philadelphia Inquirer published a thoughtful retrospective, examining how the investigation had evolved alongside forensic technology, featuring interviews with both Reeves and Ortiz about the ongoing efforts. Local news channels broadcast segments showing the now dramatically changed city locations connected to the case, from the modernized Penn's Landing waterfront to the gentrified Society Hill neighborhood where Sarah's row house had been renovated beyond recognition. What none of these commemorations could know was that in a laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania, a breakthrough was quietly unfolding. The enhanced DNA testing had yielded results that would soon shatter the 25 years of silence surrounding Sarah Miller's fate. On December 7, 2012, Elizabeth's phone rang shortly after 9 a.m. Detective Ortiz's voice carried an urgency Elizabeth immediately recognized. "We need to meet in person, today if possible." 3 hours later, Elizabeth sat in a conference room at police headquarters, hands clasped tightly as Ortiz and the laboratory director explained their findings. The advanced DNA testing had identified previously undetectable genetic material on both the driver's seat and the trunk carpet fibers, material that didn't belong to Sarah. "We were able to develop a complete DNA profile," the lab director explained, sliding a folder across the table. "When we ran it through modern databases, we found no direct matches. However, we did identify multiple partial matches indicating family relationships." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "Family relationships?" "Yes," Ortiz continued. "This is where investigative genetic genealogy comes in. These partial matches are people who share enough DNA markers to be relatives, cousins, second cousins, of whoever left DNA in Sarah's car. By building family trees from these matches and working backward and then forward again, we've identified a pool of potential individuals who could be the source." The technique was relatively new in criminal investigations, combining traditional genealogical research with DNA science. It had solved several high-profile cold cases in recent years by identifying suspects whose DNA had never been entered into law enforcement databases, but whose relatives had voluntarily submitted DNA to Ancestry or health services. Elizabeth leaned back, processing the implications. "How many potential matches are we talking about?" "We've narrowed it to 17 men who would have been in the Philadelphia area in 1987, based on the family trees we've constructed," Ortiz replied. "And here's where our parallel investigation becomes crucial. 3 of these individuals worked for Eastern Municipal Services during the sewer project near Geno's." For the first time in 25 years, Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. Not the quicksand of false hope, but something solid, a real, tangible connection between physical evidence and specific individuals who had reason to be near where Sarah was last seen. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We identify and locate these 3 men," Ortiz said firmly. "We obtain DNA samples for direct comparison, and if we match the profile from Sarah's car, we finally get answers." As Elizabeth left the police station, the December air felt different against her face, sharper, more immediate. She looked up at the Philadelphia skyline, so transformed from the city Sarah had known. For 25 years, she had carried her sister's memory through a landscape of uncertainty. Now, for the first time, she could see the outline of a resolution taking shape, like a distant shore, finally visible after decades adrift. The path toward that resolution remained complex and uncertain. The 3 former construction workers would need to be located, approached carefully to avoid alerting a potential perpetrator. Legal hurdles for obtaining DNA comparisons would need to be navigated. And even if a match was found, 25 years of elapsed time presented challenges for building a prosecutable case. Yet as Elizabeth walked through the streets of Philadelphia, past the historic buildings that had witnessed her sister's last known movements, she felt Sarah's presence more vividly than she had in years, not as a fading memory or a cold case file, but as a person whose story might finally be told in full. Detective Lena Ortiz moved with cautious determination after the DNA breakthrough in December 2012. The 3 former Eastern Municipal Services employees, identified through investigative genetic genealogy, required careful handling. One had died in 2003, another had moved to Arizona. The third, Raymond Holloway, still lived in Philadelphia's suburbs, working as a foreman for a commercial construction company. Background investigation into Holloway revealed concerning details. In 1987, he had been 34 years old, recently divorced, with a history of workplace conflicts, though no criminal record. Records showed he had indeed worked the night shift on the sewer project near Geno's during November 1987. Most significantly, city vehicle registration archives confirmed he had owned a dark blue Dodge van during that period, potentially matching the witness description from the night Sarah disappeared. "We need to approach this methodically," Ortiz explained to Elizabeth during their weekly meeting in January 2013. They sat in a small cafe away from police headquarters, the winter light casting long shadows across their table. "If Holloway is responsible, we can't risk alerting him before securing physical evidence." Elizabeth nodded, hands wrapped around her coffee cup to steady them. After 25 years of searching, the possibility of answers felt almost surreal. "What's the next step?" "The surveillance and DNA collection," Ortiz replied. "We need a sample from Holloway to compare against what we found in Sarah's car. A discarded coffee cup, cigarette, anything with cells we can test without him knowing." The Philadelphia Police Department assembled a small surveillance team that tracked Holloway's movements discreetly. Officers in plainclothes observed his routine, leaving his Bensalem home at 6 a.m., stopping at the same diner for breakfast, overseeing various construction sites throughout the day, then returning home, or occasionally visiting a local bar. Nothing in his current behavior suggested someone harboring a decades-old violent secret, which made the surveillance all the more unnerving. On February 3, 2013, after weeks of observation, the team got their opportunity. Holloway visited a shopping center food court, discarding a soda cup and straw before departing. An undercover officer retrieved the items, placing them in sterile evidence bags. The cup traveled directly to the same university laboratory that had processed the original evidence. For 6 days, Elizabeth jumped at every phone call, alternating between hope and dread. When Detective Ortiz finally contacted her, the message was simple: "We need to meet in person." At police headquarters, Ortiz sat beside the laboratory director, both with expressions that Elizabeth had learned to read all too well over decades of investigation. But this time, there was something different, a tightly controlled energy behind their professional demeanor. "The DNA from Holloway's cup is a match to the genetic material found in Sarah's car," the lab director stated, sliding a report across the conference table. "Not a partial match or a possible match, a definitive match. The profile is identical across all markers." Elizabeth stared at the document, scientific notation blurring as tears filled her eyes. After 25 years of uncertainty, theories, and dead ends, science had provided an unambiguous connection between her sister's disappearance and a specific person. She looked up at Ortiz. "What happens now?" "We build a case," Ortiz replied. "The DNA match gives us probable cause for search warrants. We'll examine Holloway's property, vehicles, electronic records, anything that might contain additional evidence linking him to Sarah." The investigation accelerated with judicial approval. On February 15, 2013, teams executed simultaneous search warrants at Holloway's Bensalem home, his workplace office, and a storage unit registered in his name. Holloway was detained for questioning while forensic technicians methodically processed each location. The storage unit, rented continuously since 1992, yielded the first significant discovery: a cardboard box containing women's jewelry from the 1980s, including a distinctive silver bracelet with turquoise inlays that Elizabeth immediately identified from photographs as Sarah's, a gift from their parents on her college graduation. More damning still, technicians found a small journal hidden beneath floorboards in Holloway's basement, containing cryptic entries dating back to 1987, with the page marked November 12th containing only the notation SM finished. Retired Detective James Reeves, now 75, received permission to observe the questioning from behind a one-way mirror. He watched as Holloway, grey-haired and stocky at 59, maintained a facade of confused innocence during the first hours of interrogation. Ortiz methodically established Holloway's employment history, gradually narrowing toward November 1987, while avoiding any mention of Sarah Miller. When finally shown the bracelet recovered from his storage unit, Holloway's composure fractured visibly. "That's not mine," he stammered. "I don't know how that got there." Ortiz placed a photograph of Sarah beside the bracelet. "Do you recognize this woman?" "No," Holloway replied too quickly, his eyes darting to the exit. "Never seen her before." "That's interesting," Ortiz responded calmly, "because we found your DNA in her car, the same car that was abandoned at Penn's Landing in 1987. The interrogation room fell silent. Holloway's breathing became audible as he stared at the photo, the confidence draining from his posture. Behind the glass, Reeves leaned forward, recognizing the moment when a suspect realizes the evidence against them is overwhelming. After 20 minutes of silence, Holloway spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "It was an accident. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Over the next 3 hours, Raymond Holloway confessed to the crime that had haunted Philadelphia for 25 years. The account he provided, later corroborated by physical evidence, revealed the terrible truth of Sarah Miller's final hours. On November 12, 1987, Holloway had been working the night shift on the sewer project near Geno's. During his dinner break, he had seen Sarah walking to her car alone. Acting on impulse, he approached her, claiming to be having car trouble and asking for help. When Sarah hesitantly agreed to look at his van, he forced her inside, at knife point. Holloway drove to a secluded area near the Delaware River. Sarah had fought desperately, scratching him, which explained the DNA under her nails, and attempting to escape, resulting in the blood on her car's driver's seat when he later moved it to Penn's Landing as a diversion. The struggle ended with Holloway striking her fatally with a wrench from his work tools. In a final cruel act, he had buried Sarah in the partially excavated sewer trench his crew had been working on, returning the next night to cover her remains with cement, as scheduled in the construction plan. The site had subsequently been paved over, becoming part of the urban landscape, a terrible secret literally buried beneath the streets of Philadelphia. Elizabeth received the news from Detective Ortiz personally, the stark reality, both devastating and strangely relieving after decades of uncertainty. "We know what happened now," Ortiz said gently, "and we know where to find her." The excavation of the sewer line beneath the intersection, 3 blocks from Geno's, began on February 28, 2013. City workers carefully broke through layers of asphalt and concrete, then proceeded with archaeological precision as they reached the depth where Holloway indicated he had buried Sarah. Media kept a respectful distance, but the presence of news vans and the temporary street closure created a somber atmosphere in the neighborhood. Elizabeth stood behind police barriers, Michael beside her, as technicians in white protective suits worked methodically in the excavated trench. Shortly after noon, activity in the pit suddenly stilled. A technician climbed out and spoke quietly to Detective Ortiz, who then approached Elizabeth with an expression of profound gravity. "We found human remains," she confirmed. consistent with Sarah's description and the clothing she was wearing that night. In the days that followed, forensic anthropologists carefully recovered Sarah's remains, preserving every detail for both identification and evidence. Dental records confirmed her identity, while the medical examiner documented injuries consistent with Holloway's confession. Most poignantly, Sarah was found still wearing her watch, stopped at 9:42 p.m. on November 12, 1987, marking the moment time had frozen for her, while the world continued turning for 25 years. News of the discovery and Holloway's arrest exploded across Philadelphia and beyond. National networks covered the story extensively, focusing on the role of advanced DNA technology and persistent investigation in solving one of the city's most notorious cold cases. Headlines proclaimed, "DNA breakthrough solves 25-year mystery and justice for Sarah Miller, Philadelphia cold case finally closed." The Philadelphia Inquirer published a comprehensive retrospective spanning 3 full pages, chronicling the investigation from 1987 to 2013 and featuring photographs of Sarah, Elizabeth, and the detectives who had refused to let the case fade away. A sidebar detailed the evolution of forensic DNA technology that had ultimately broken the case, from the rudimentary tests available in the 1980s to the sophisticated genealogical methods that identified Holloway. Raymond Holloway was formally charged with kidnapping, first-degree murder, and abuse of a corpse. The district attorney's office announced they would seek the maximum penalty, though the death penalty had been under an effective moratorium in Pennsylvania since 2015. The strength of the evidence, DNA match, confession, physical evidence, and recovery of Sarah's remains left little doubt about the eventual verdict. For retired Detective Reeves, the resolution brought complex emotions. At 25 years, he murmured, standing outside the courthouse after Holloway's arraignment, "I always believed we'd find the truth, but I never imagined it would be cemented under our feet all this time." Elizabeth faced reporters with remarkable composure after the preliminary hearing. "Sarah fought until her last moment," she said, voice steady despite the cameras and microphones pressed toward her. "She left evidence that eventually led to this day. Even when science wasn't advanced enough, she had made sure it would be someday." On April 10, 2013, Sarah Miller finally received a proper burial at Laurel Hill Cemetery, overlooking the Schuylkill River. The service drew hundreds of attendees, including former students, now in their 30s with children of their own, police officers who had worked the case over decades, and community members who had kept Sarah's memory alive through years of uncertainty. Franklin Elementary closed for the day, allowing teachers and staff to attend. The current principal spoke movingly about Sarah's lasting impact on the school, noting that students still benefited from the Sarah Miller Memorial Library and annual educational grants established in her name. Former colleagues shared memories of her innovative teaching methods and dedication to children with learning difficulties, a legacy that had continued even in her absence. Most poignant were the words from Sarah's former students, who spoke of how their third-grade teacher had shaped their lives in ways they only fully appreciated as adults. One, now a teacher herself, described how Sarah's creative approach to science had inspired her own career. "Ms. Miller showed us that learning should be an adventure. She's been guiding my classroom methods for 25 years, even though I only knew her for 8 months. As Sarah was laid to rest beneath a maple tree, reminiscent of the one in her family picnic photo, Elizabeth placed a small display beside the casket, Sarah's recovered bracelet, her teaching certificate, and a children's book about butterflies that she had been planning to read to her class the day after she disappeared. These tangible connections to Sarah's life provided a counterpoint to the grim circumstances of her death, reminding those gathered of the vibrant woman who had been taken too soon. The legal proceedings against Raymond Holloway unfolded throughout 2013, culminating in a trial that October. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: DNA matches, the recovered bracelet, Holloway's detailed confession, and testimony from forensic experts who had analyzed Sarah's remains. Defense attorneys, acknowledging the strength of the case against their client, focused primarily on avoiding the harshest possible sentence by emphasizing Holloway's claim that the murder had not been premeditated. Elizabeth attended every day of the trial, often accompanied by Michael and occasionally by former students of Sarah's. The Philadelphia courtroom fell completely silent when the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict after just 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. 2 weeks later, the judge sentenced Holloway to life in prison without possibility of parole, stating that the defendant had robbed not only Sarah Miller of her life, but robbed an entire community of her continuing contributions. Outside the courthouse, Elizabeth stood before a forest of microphones and cameras, her expression reflecting both relief and the weight of a 25-year journey. "Justice delayed is still justice," she began, her voice steady. "Sarah can finally rest, and our family can begin a different kind of healing. But this case represents more than one person's tragedy. It shows what's possible when science, dedication, and community refuse to let the truth disappear." The impact of Sarah Miller's case extended far beyond the courtroom. The Philadelphia Police Department secured additional funding to expand its cold case unit and update its DNA analysis capabilities. Detective Ortiz became a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, explaining how the combination of traditional investigative methods and cutting-edge genetic genealogy had solved a case once considered unsolvable. For Elizabeth, the resolution of Sarah's case marked not an ending, but a transformation of purpose. Having dedicated half her life to finding answers, she now channeled that same determination into supporting other families of missing persons. Her non-profit organization expanded, providing resources for families navigating similar ordeals and advocating for continued investment in forensic technology to resolve cold cases. In 2014, the organization launched the Sarah Miller Initiative, which funded advanced DNA testing for cold cases involving missing persons. Within its first year, the initiative contributed to resolving 3 long-dormant investigations in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Sarah's legacy isn't just about her case being solved, Elizabeth explained during a fundraising event. It's about creating hope for other families still waiting, still searching. Every cold case is someone's Sarah. Someone deserves to come home, even if only for a proper goodbye. The case also prompted educational institutions to develop specialized programs in forensic genealogy. The University of Pennsylvania, whose laboratory had processed the crucial DNA evidence, established a certificate program training specialists in the intersection of traditional genealogical research and forensic science. The first graduating class included several police officers and victim advocates, expanding the network of professionals equipped to apply these techniques to unsolved cases. Retired Detective Reeves found unexpected purpose in his later years, becoming a mentor to young investigators interested in cold case methodology. Though his health limited his activities, he conducted workshops from his home, sharing insights from his decades of experience and emphasizing the human element behind every unsolved case. "Technology solves cases," he would tell his students, "but human persistence creates the opportunities for technology to work." Sarah Miller wasn't found because of DNA alone. She was found because people refused to forget her. The intersection where Sarah had been buried was permanently transformed following the excavation. The city installed a small parklet featuring a bronze plaque commemorating her life and the quarter-century journey to truth. Local residents maintained the space meticulously, often placing fresh flowers beside the plaque on significant dates. The location transformed from an unmarked grave to a place of remembrance and reflection. Franklin Elementary expanded its tribute to Sarah beyond the library named in her honor. The school established an annual Sarah Miller Teaching Excellence Award, recognizing educators who demonstrated exceptional creativity and dedication to their students. The ceremony each spring became a tradition, bringing together current teachers, students, and community members to celebrate educational innovation, qualities Sarah had embodied in her brief career. In November 2017, on the 30th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, Philadelphia Magazine published a comprehensive article titled "The Teacher Who Changed Philadelphia." The piece explored not just the details of the case, but its broader impact on the city's approach to public safety, community vigilance, and the treatment of cold cases. The article included reflections from former mayors, police commissioners, and community leaders about how Sarah's case had influenced policy decisions and resource allocation over 3 decades. More personally, the article featured interviews with Sarah's former third-grade students, now approaching middle age, discussing how their brief time with Ms. Miller had influenced their lives. One described becoming a detective partly inspired by her case. Another had named his daughter Sarah in her memory. Several had entered teaching, carrying forward methods and approaches they remembered from their year in her classroom. For Elizabeth, who had recently marked her 60th birthday, these stories represented the answer to a question that had haunted her. What would Sarah's impact have been had she lived? The ripples of her sister's too brief life had spread outward through generations of students, through changes in forensic science, through families who found answers because of methods pioneered in her case. On a crisp autumn morning in 2018, Elizabeth visited Sarah's grave at Laurel Hill Cemetery, bringing a small potted chrysanthemum, their mother's favorite flower. After placing it beside the headstone, she sat on a nearby bench, watching fallen leaves dance across the peaceful grounds. "I used to think closure meant endings," she reflected later to Detective Ortiz, who had become a close friend through their shared journey. "But I've realized it's about transformation. Sarah's story didn't end when we found her or when Holloway went to prison. It became something different, something that continues to matter." Ortiz nodded, understanding the profound truth in Elizabeth's words. "Some cases change how we see justice itself," she replied. "Sarah's changed mine." By 2020, the Sarah Miller case had become part of training curriculum for forensic science programs nationwide, a textbook example of how preserved evidence, advancing technology, and investigative persistence could combine to solve seemingly hopeless cold cases. Law enforcement agencies in several states had modeled cold case protocols on Philadelphia's approach to the Miller investigation, emphasizing evidence preservation and periodic review as technology evolved. The impact reached beyond professional circles into popular culture. A critically acclaimed documentary series explored the case in depth, featuring interviews with Elizabeth, detectives Reeves and Ortiz, forensic scientists, and others connected to the investigation. Rather than sensationalizing the crime, the production focused on the methodical process of pursuing truth across decades and the resilience of those who refused to abandon the search. For Philadelphia itself, the resolution of Sarah Miller's case represented a form of collective healing. The city had carried her disappearance as an open wound for 25 years, a reminder of vulnerability in a place that valued community and connection. The knowledge that justice had finally been served, though delayed, restored something essential to the civic spirit. In the epilogue to her memoir, published in 2022, Elizabeth wrote words that resonated far beyond those who had followed Sarah's case. Justice isn't measured only in courtroom verdicts or prison sentences. It's measured in truth revealed, in names remembered, in communities transformed by both tragedy and resolution. Sarah's story reminds us that no voice is ever truly silenced when others continue to speak for it, and no mystery is unsolvable when we refuse to look away. On the bench in Laurel Hill Cemetery overlooking Sarah's final resting place, A small brass plate bears a simple inscription that captures the essence of a case that spanned generations and changed a city. For Sarah Miller, teacher and truth seeker. Your lessons continue. The city of brotherly love had indeed betrayed one of its daughters on a November evening in 1987. But in the decades that followed, that same city had demonstrated the power of community, science, and unwavering determination to recover what was lost, if not Sarah herself, then at least the truth of what happened to her and the opportunity to learn from her story. In that transformation from mystery to meaning, Philadelphia had reclaimed its name and its promise, carrying Sarah's legacy forward into a future she would never see but had helped to shape. The Sarah Miller case continued to resonate within the forensic community long after Raymond Holloway's conviction. By 2023, the investigation had become a foundational case study at the FBI Academy's training program in Quantico, illustrating the power of evidence preservation and technological advancement in solving cold cases. Special Agent Meera Patel, who specialized in investigative genetic genealogy, frequently referenced the case during her lectures. What makes the Miller case so significant, Patel explained to a class of new agents, is how it demonstrates the evolution of forensic science across generations. Evidence collected in 1987 using protocols that seem primitive by today's standards still contained enough viable material to yield results with technology that didn't exist when the crime occurred. It's why we emphasize proper collection and preservation above all else. You're not just gathering evidence for today's technology, but for tomorrow's breakthroughs. The case's impact extended far beyond law enforcement circles. Dr. Elaine Winters, chair of the Forensic Science Department at Temple University, developed an entire semester-long course examining the Sarah Miller investigation through multiple disciplinary lenses, from the original evidence collection methodologies to the genealogical techniques that ultimately identified Holloway. Students find this case particularly compelling because it spans such a transformative period in forensic science, Dr. Winters noted during an interview with Scientific American. When Sarah disappeared in 1987, DNA analysis was in its infancy. By the time Holloway was identified in 2013, we were using techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators working the original case. The broader public remained fascinated by the case as well. In 2024, a major streaming service released 25 Years of Silence, a limited series dramatizing the investigation. Unlike typical true crime productions that focused primarily on the perpetrator, this series centered on Elizabeth's unwavering pursuit of truth and the evolving investigation techniques. The show received critical acclaim for its sensitive portrayal of victim advocacy and its technical accuracy regarding forensic methodology. Elizabeth Brennan, though initially hesitant about the production, ultimately served as a consultant. I wanted to ensure Sarah was portrayed as a person first, a teacher, a daughter, a sister, not just a victim, she explained during a panel discussion following the series premiere. And I wanted viewers to understand that cold cases aren't just files gathering dust. They're ongoing absences in families' lives, questions that need answering no matter how much time passes. The series sparked renewed interest in cold case investigations nationwide. Police departments reported significant increases in tips related to long-dormant cases, while genealogical DNA testing services noted a surge in participants specifically opting in to law enforcement matching programs. This phenomenon, dubbed the Sarah Miller effect by criminologists, demonstrated how a single, well-publicized case resolution could mobilize public engagement with unsolved crimes more broadly. In Philadelphia, the impact remained especially pronounced. The city's cold case unit, which had expanded following Holloway's arrest, continued to apply lessons learned from the Miller investigation to other unsolved cases. Between 2013 and 2025, the unit resolved 17 cases that had remained open for more than a decade. including 3 disappearances from the same era as Sarah's. The Miller case changed how we approach cold cases fundamentally, explained Captain Jerome Washington, who supervised the unit. We implemented regular review schedules to re-evaluate evidence as technology advances, partnerships with academic institutions for specialized testing, and deeper integration of genealogical research into our investigative process. These aren't just policy changes, they're Sarah's legacy. Perhaps most significantly, the case transformed how law enforcement agencies throughout Pennsylvania handled missing persons reports. The Sarah Miller Protocol, formally adopted by the state in 2021, established comprehensive standards for evidence collection, witness interviews, and scene preservation in the critical early hours after a disappearance. The protocol emphasized treating these cases with the same forensic rigor as homicides from the outset, ensuring that if a case did go cold, future investigators would have the highest quality evidence available when new technologies emerged. Elizabeth, now in her mid-60s, remained actively involved in advocacy work. Her organization, initially focused on supporting families of missing persons, had evolved into a significant player in forensic policy development. In 2025, she testified before Congress in support of the National Cold Case Resource Act, legislation that would provide federal funding for DNA analysis of evidence from unsolved violent crimes. My sister's case demonstrates that justice delayed need not be justice denied, Elizabeth told the Congressional Committee. But we cannot rely on luck or the extraordinary dedication of individual investigators. We need systematic approaches to preserving and periodically re-examining evidence from unsolved cases. Every family deserves answers, regardless of when their loved one disappeared. The bill passed with bipartisan support, creating a dedicated funding stream for cold case DNA analysis nationwide. During the signing ceremony at the White House, the president specifically cited Sarah Miller's case as an example of how forensic technology could bridge decades to deliver justice. Elizabeth stood among the dignitaries on the stage, a physical embodiment of the persistence that had made such progress possible. In Philadelphia, the annual remembrance of Sarah's life evolved from a solemn vigil to a more hopeful event celebrating advances in justice and education, the 2 fields she had influenced most. Profoundly, Franklin Elementary School, where the Sarah Miller Teaching Excellence Award continued to recognize innovative educators, hosted a science fair each November focusing on forensic techniques explained at age-appropriate levels. Students learned basic principles of DNA, fingerprint analysis, and evidence preservation through hands-on experiments designed by university partners. We wanted to transform a tragic anniversary into something forward-looking, explained Dr. Marcus Chen, Franklin's principal since 2020. Sarah was passionate about making science accessible to children. These events honor that legacy while introducing students to fields that might not otherwise cross their radar until much later in their education. The school's approach captured the attention of educational researchers who documented increased interest in STEM subjects among students participating in the program. By 2026, similar initiatives had been implemented in dozens of schools across the Northeast, creating what educators called the Sarah Miller pipeline of students pursuing forensic science and related fields. Retired Detective James Reeves, though increasingly limited by health issues as he entered his 80s, remained connected to the case's ongoing impact. He occasionally visited Franklin Elementary during their November events, answering students' questions about the investigation with carefully age-appropriate details. These appearances became treasured traditions, connecting children to the real-world significance behind their scientific experiments. During one such visit in 2026, a third-grade girl approached Reeves after his presentation. "My grandma was in Miss Miller's class," she said, handing him a carefully folded paper butterfly. She said Ms. Miller taught them about metamorphosis, and that sometimes justice is like that too. It changes form, but doesn't disappear. Reeves accepted the butterfly, momentarily speechless at the perfect metaphor from a child too young to have known Sarah, but still touched by her influence. This intergenerational connection exemplified how thoroughly Sarah's story had woven itself into Philadelphia's cultural fabric, not just as a famous crime, but as a narrative about persistence, scientific progress, and the human capacity to continue seeking truth against seemingly impossible odds. The physical markers of Sarah's case evolved as well. In 2027, the city redesigned the small parklet at the intersection where her remains had been recovered. Working with students from the University of Pennsylvania's School of Design, Philadelphia created a contemplative space featuring a circular stone bench surrounding a small fountain. Embedded in the pavement were bronze medallions, highlighting milestones in the case's resolution, creating a timeline that visitors could follow from 1987 to 2013. The redesign received national attention, featured in urban planning journals as an example of commemorative public space that balanced honoring victims with educating the public. Unlike conventional crime memorials that often focused exclusively on loss, the Sarah Miller Parklet explicitly celebrated the scientific and investigative advances that had ultimately resolved her case. We wanted to create a space that acknowledged tragedy without being defined by it, explained the project's lead designer. Visitors leave understanding not just what happened to Sarah, but how her case transformed how we approach unsolved crimes. A narrative arc that ends with justice rather than victimhood. For Elizabeth, these various memorials and initiatives provided comfort in their demonstration that Sarah's influence continued expanding rather than diminishing with time. During a rare television interview on the 15th anniversary of Holloway's conviction, she reflected on this unexpected legacy. "When Sarah disappeared, I feared she would be forgotten," Elizabeth said, her silver hair and composed demeanor reflecting the decades that had passed. "Then I feared she would be remembered only as a victim. What's emerged instead is something neither of us could have imagined. Her name associated with scientific breakthrough, with educational innovation, with policy reform. It doesn't erase what happened, but it creates meaning that transcends tragedy." Raymond Holloway, serving his life sentence at State Correctional Institution Phoenix, remained largely forgotten by the public that had once been shocked by his arrest. He declined most interview requests, though occasionally spoke with researchers studying cold case resolution's impact on perpetrators. In one such interview conducted for a criminology dissertation in 2028, he acknowledged the advances in forensic science that had led to his conviction. "I spent 25 years thinking I was free," he told the researcher. "Even when DNA testing started becoming news, I wasn't worried. They didn't have my DNA on file and the evidence was old. I didn't understand they could find me through relatives who never even met me. The technology outran my understanding completely." His words, published in academic journals but largely unnoticed by the general public, provided valuable insight for investigators working similar cold cases. They confirmed what many had theorized. Perpetrators who successfully evaded justice for decades often developed a false sense of invulnerability, unaware of how forensic capabilities were evolving beyond their comprehension. The implications extended beyond individual cases to broader questions about deterrence in an era of rapidly advancing forensic technology. Criminologists noted that publicizing cold case resolutions like Sarah's might serve as a powerful warning that time alone no longer provided. Protection from justice, a concept some termed retrospective deterrence. In 2029, this principle found dramatic validation when 3 men in separate states turned themselves in for unsolved murders committed decades earlier, each specifically citing fear of eventual identification through genealogical DNA as their motivation. One left a note explicitly mentioning the Sarah Miller case, writing, "If they found him after 25 years, they'll find me too. I can't live with the waiting anymore." These surrenders prompted renewed media interest in the Miller case as a watershed moment in criminal justice. The Philadelphia Inquirer published a special report titled "The Long Shadow of Sarah Miller," examining how a single case had altered the calculus for perpetrators of unsolved crimes across the country. Elizabeth, approaching 70 but still actively engaged in advocacy work, found herself fielding interview requests from international media outlets interested in this unexpected development. Speaking to the BBC, she observed, "Sarah fought in her final moments, leaving evidence that eventually led to justice. What we're seeing now is the exponential impact of that evidence combined with scientific advancement, a deterrent effect that reaches backward through time." This concept of evidence resonating across decades took physical form in 2030, when the Philadelphia Police Department opened its new Forensic Science Center. The facility's atrium featured a striking installation, a double helix structure with illuminated markers highlighting key advancements in DNA technology from 1987 to the present. At its base, a plaque acknowledged the Sarah Miller case's role in demonstrating how preserved evidence could bridge technological eras. The center included an educational wing open to school groups and community organizations, where visitors could learn about forensic techniques through interactive exhibits. One popular station allowed participants to extract DNA from strawberries using household chemicals, demonstrating in simplified form the basic principles behind the technologies that had solved Sarah's case. "We designed this space not just for future forensic scientists, but for everyone," explained Dr. Natasha Rodriguez, the center's educational director. Understanding the science behind justice helps communities appreciate why evidence preservation matters, why cold cases aren't hopeless, and why technological advancement continues to change what's possible in criminal investigations. On the center's opening day, Elizabeth cut the ribbon alongside Detective Ortiz. Now Captain Ortiz heading the Major Crimes Division, and a frail but determined James Reeves, who had insisted on attending despite health challenges. The moment captured 3 generations of connection to Sarah's case, the family that never stopped searching, the investigator who found the breakthrough, and the detective who had carried the case through its darkest years. As they stood together, Elizabeth whispered something to Reeves that nearby microphones didn't catch. Later, when asked by a reporter, she shared their exchange. "I told him Sarah would be proud of how her case had transformed into something that protects others. He said that's the best kind of justice, the kind that ripples outward." This ripple effect continued in unexpected ways. In 2031, advances in forensic technology enabled new analysis of evidence from Raymond Holloway's storage unit, revealing connections to 2 additional unsolved disappearances from the late 1980s. DNA from items in his possession matched samples preserved from these cases, confirming suspicions that Sarah had not been his only victim. For the families of these 2 women, who had endured decades of uncertainty, the revelation brought the same complex mixture of grief and resolution that Elizabeth had experienced years earlier. In a profound demonstration of empathy born from shared experience, Elizabeth reached out to both families, offering the guidance and support that only someone who had walked a similar path could provide. When they found the connections to Holloway, my first thought wasn't about him being worse than we knew, Elizabeth explained during a panel discussion at a victims' advocacy conference. It was about these families finally getting answers. After 40 years of questions, they deserved the truth, however painful, and they deserved to know their loved ones weren't forgotten. The resolution of these additional cases further cemented the Sarah Miller investigation's status as a landmark in forensic history. What had begun as the disappearance of one teacher in 1987 had evolved into a case that demonstrated the power of evidence preservation across multiple investigations spanning decades. Criminology textbooks updated their chapters on the case, now presenting it as an example of how a single breakthrough can illuminate multiple unsolved crimes through careful evidence analysis. Throughout these developments, Franklin Elementary School continued its tradition of honoring Sarah's memory through education. In 2033, the school unveiled a cutting-edge science laboratory funded through a partnership with the University of Pennsylvania and private donors. Named the Sarah Miller Discovery Lab, the facility provided elementary students with hands-on learning experiences typically unavailable until high school or beyond. At the dedication ceremony, Elizabeth marveled at how thoroughly Sarah's professional passion had been preserved and amplified. Sarah taught here for just over 3 years, she noted, but her influence on this school has lasted 15 times that long. The students learning in this lab weren't even born when her case was solved, yet they're benefiting from her legacy every day. This continuation across generations represented the most meaningful form of justice for Elizabeth, not just the legal resolution of her sister's case, but the transformation of tragedy into ongoing positive influence. As she walked through the lab, watching young students conduct simple experiments with enthusiasm that mirrored what colleagues had described in Sarah, Elizabeth felt the circle closing in the most healing way possible. The final chapter of Sarah Miller's story, or perhaps more accurately, the latest chapter in an ongoing narrative, came in 2035, nearly half a century after her disappearance. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History opened a major exhibition titled Science and Justice: How Technology Transforms Criminal Investigation. Among the featured case studies was a comprehensive display on Sarah Miller, tracing the investigation from 1987 through its resolution and ongoing impact. The exhibit included carefully selected artifacts, the original missing person flyer with Sarah's photo, the turquoise bracelet recovered from Holloway's storage unit, and the logbook, where Detective Reeves had documented his continued work on the case long after it had officially gone cold. Interactive displays allowed visitors to explore how DNA technology had evolved during the investigation's timeline, with simplified explanations of how genealogical techniques had ultimately identified Holloway. Most powerfully, the exhibition featured video testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by the case. Former students who remembered Sarah's teaching, cold case detectives inspired by the investigation, forensic scientists who had worked on similar breakthroughs, and family members of missing persons who found hope in Sarah's eventual resolution. Elizabeth, now 75, attended the exhibition opening in Washington, D.C. As she toured the displays, a museum docent not recognizing her explained the significance of the case to a group of high school students. Elizabeth listened quietly, moved by hearing her family's story presented as an important thread in the national narrative of scientific progress and justice. When the docent finished, Elizabeth gently introduced herself to the surprised group. A student asked what she hoped people would take from the exhibition. After a thoughtful pause, Elizabeth responded with words that captured the essence of a journey spanning nearly 5 decades. "I hope they understand that no mystery remains unsolvable forever. That evidence preserves truth even when we lack the technology to reveal it immediately. That persistence matters. Whether it's a detective reviewing old files after hours, a scientist refining testing methods, or a family refusing to let a loved one be forgotten. And most importantly, that Sarah was more than a famous case. She was a teacher who believed knowledge transforms lives. Looking around at how her story continues educating people about science and justice, I think she would feel her life's mission continues, just in ways none of us could have imagined." As visitors moved through the Smithsonian exhibition that day, and in the years that followed, they encountered not just the technical details of a famous cold case, but a profound narrative about human determination, scientific advancement, and the enduring impact of both a life cut short and the quest to honor it with truth. Sarah Miller, teacher, sister, daughter, and ultimately catalyst for transformation, had found her place in American history, her story continuing to educate long after she last stood before a classroom. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.